I will turn it over at this point to Rob Cole. Rob is a forester and certified arborist with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. He has been with New York DEC since 2006 and has spent the last 15 years managing oak wilt across the state of New York. So welcome, Rob, and take it away.
All right, good morning, everyone. Is my presentation up?
Yes, it is.
All right, excellent. All right, yep, so thanks for having me. I'm going to talk a little bit about our oak wilt response here in New York. And I'm a forester and certified arborist with the Department of Environmental Conservation. Yeah, I've worked on oak wilt quite a bit. So I have, I think, about 20 slides, and I'm going to try to keep 10 minutes or so open at the end of this for questions. So let's get moving right along. So this picture here, I'm going to have pictures of leaves from trees with oak wilt. I'm going to have these pictures kind of throughout the presentation, just so you can see a little bit of the variability and the discoloration that you can find if you go online. Maybe some Forest Service publications or things like that. They give you the best case, the best looking discolored leaves, best examples of oak wilt that there are out there, and some people just get surprised by the variability. So these leaves are from an oak wilt positive tree and discolored by oak wilt. So just quickly, want to show, sorry about that. Just where we have oak wilt in New York to give you a little bit of perspective when I'm showing some pictures, what I'm talking about, where we're seeing that. So oak wilt was first discovered in New York in 2008, and that was discovered just outside of Albany here. In Schenectady County, in the town of Glenville. It was in a nice subdivision with a big sign out front of it called Glen Oaks. So as you can imagine, there was a lot of oak trees in this location. And since then, this is that original location. We found it there again about 5 years later. I'll talk a little bit about that. And since then, we've kind of found it around the town in a couple other locations. So we have had oak wilt in this area for 15 years. This was our first location found. Additionally, we have this area here south of Rochester in the Finger Lakes area, and around one of the lakes in particular, Canandaigua Lake. This lake here, just for reference, is about 15 miles long and 1.5 miles wide at its widest point. Its deepest point is around 270 feet. So around this lake, we have multiple locations. As you can see, this is what I would consider a fairly active area. Most of these locations at this point are more forested. So I'll talk a little bit about them, but I am focusing on more of the suburban area for this talk. We also have had multiple detections on Long Island, and these were suburbia at its best. So I'll have some discussion on this as well. Next, just going to go over oak wilt biology a little bit for those who aren't familiar. Oak wilt is spread in a few different ways. First being by sap beetles or knitted beetles. And what these beetles do is they go to a tree that has had oak wilt and produced one of these spore mats here. You can see in the picture, these spore mats, or sometimes called pressure pads, they grow right on the wood underneath the bark. And as they grow, they push up the bark and create a little crack. And that's how the insects get in there. And the knitted they get in there and they eat and play around and get the spores on them. And then they leave and they go to a healthy oak tree that has some sort of wound on it. That could be from a windstorm, ice storm, something like that. It could also be from pruning, from humans trying to take care of a tree. That is temporarily a wound when we prune, and the niditudes can be attracted to that as well. So they go to these fresh wounds, they get under the bark, they deposit the fungal spores in the spring, and then later that summer, you start to see this wilting. And see, here's kind of the characteristic Forest Service depiction. Typically, the wilting is described as from the top of the leaf or the outside of the leaf in. And you can see it turns, a orangey brown, really dries out, gets really papery. And the discoloration is typically from the top of the tree down through the canopy and the leaf drop. So you'll see in this image, they show minimal leaves on the top. Typically with oak wilt, you'll see that leaf drop about 80% of the leaves or more, and that occurs midsummer. So then you have the dead tree standing there during the summer. If it stands there through the winter and into the spring, the cycle continues, the spore mats grow on it, more nitidulids come, infect new trees, and around it goes. Now, the other more complicating factor to this is that not only do the beetles spread it, but it spreads through the roots. So once a tree has it, in the fall, the fungus moves down into the roots. Oak trees root graft to one another, and so it can spread from one tree to another during the spring, and then over the summer, you see the tree die. That tree again, the next year, will form spore mats, allowing for overland spread, and it will also go back into the roots to any trees that it's root grafted to. So again, when we're managing it, we have to manage that beetle spread, and we have to manage spread through the roots. And additionally, something I'll talk about a little later in the presentation is spread on firewood. We actually have found spore mats on firewood, and we think that that's how it originally got to New York in 2008 to that Schenectady location, was through human movement of firewood from quite a long distance, we found out. And we did find some evidence in their firewood piles. So beetles spread it, roots spread it, and unfortunately humans spread it also. So I have this picture to the right here, and this is kind of a real life example of the chart I just went through. So you'll see that in the image there, I have put in kind of that orange color silhouette of a tree. That tree, we're going to say is year 0. This is the first tree that became infected. So the homeowner was getting work done on her roof of the house here. There was a branch that came over the roof, a couple branches. So to get the work done on her roof and just to get the branches away from her new shingles, prior to the work being done, she had some limbs pruned off. This work was done in May. Then the following July, she noticed she was finding a lot of leaves on her lawn. Something didn't seem right, and that tree totally defoliated and died. So the homeowner thought, well, that's weird. Maybe it's a fluke. Something happened. Maybe it'll come back next spring. So I'm going to leave it there. So she let the dead tree stand there all winter, which, as you know, could allow for spore mat production, and it could also allow for root graft transmission. So the tree stood there until the following spring. It didn't leaf back out, so she said, well, I guess it's dead. She had it cut down, removed. This tree was still here, but because this tree stood all winter long before it was cut down, there was time for the fungus to move through the roots and up into this tree. So then the following year, this tree started showing the same symptoms as the first tree did. Leaves falling off, not looking good, pretty much looking like it's dying. And as you can see in this photo, there's not a lot of leaves, but there are some leaves on the ground from this oak tree. And so one thing that the homeowner said was, this seems really atypical. I don't lose leaves this early in the summer, so I knew something was wrong. Typically, oaks hold on to their leaves well into the fall, sometimes over the winter. That particular homeowner said, yeah, I'm cleaning leaves out of my oak leaves out of my landscaping and gutters in the spring. The leaf drop is really what we focus on, and that discoloration when we're talking to homeowners or land managers. Here's a couple pictures of trees with oak wilt. You can see they've lost the majority of their leaves. These are oak trees next to them, totally green, looking perfectly healthy. And this is, in August. So those oak look just the way they should, and then these stick out like a sore thumb. Very obvious, like I said, lost a lot of leaves, and they have that orangey brown wiltiness to them. So here's a site plan that we worked up for that house that I just described with the two trees that came down. On the left, you can see pictures of the leaf drop. So again, these aren't the perfect depictions from the U.S. Forest Service. Here's the variability that we are seeing from green and yellow all the way down to totally brown and kind of anywhere in between. What you'll see in that middle picture, though, is a picture of the homeowner's yard in August, which is totally atypical. You wouldn't see discolored, partially discolored, and even just fully green leaves falling, midsummer like that, unless something was really wrong. And so that's what we focus on when we're talking to folks. I have some more pictures of the spore mats coming up, and we'll talk about that, but that really isn't what we focus on here in New York, because we find that they're a little cryptic, and the public is far better dealing with the leaf drop and discoloration. So on this plan, you can see here's that first tree that died that I had to draw in on that previous image, and then here's the second tree that died. So when we're managing oak wilt, again, because we have beetles to deal with and we have roots to deal with, management involves a couple different things. First, we want to cut down that infected tree as quickly as possible before any spore mats can form. So that's needs to be done in the fall or winter before the next spring, because the spore mats form the following spring after death. And that's because there's a really particular moisture and temperature thresholds that have to be met for the fungus to survive and grow those spore mats. And so usually that moisture threshold is achieved by the next spring. So we're removing the tree to get rid of the spores so that we can cut off the spread from the nitadulids. With root grafting, we use something called the Brune table, and this is from a publication, Brune et al., 1992. And what this table does is it predicts how far oak wilt could move through root grafts in one growing season. So, like I said, oaks root graft together. Red oaks especially readily root graft. It's not as common in white oaks, but it does happen. And so red oaks root graft, if you got red oaks near each other, they're probably root grafted. So what this table does is you measure all the trees, the infected tree, and then the closest trees, and you combine their DBH, and this gives you a distance with which oak wilt could travel in a season underground from the infected tree to other trees. So these trees here, 4, 5, 6, and 7, were all within root grafting distance, transmission distance of tree number 2, the currently infected tree. So those trees we cut down and herbicided the stumps. We want to make sure that the roots die. We don't want these trees to be able to pull any of the fungus over this direction. Now, additionally, the homeowner had several oak trees between here and the road. The road is just off the picture here. Several oak trees that she didn't want to lose as a screen to the road. And she had a beautiful large oak tree over her back patio, shaded the back of her house. Really, these trees would have been a really serious loss. So We decided we could also put in a trench to break any root grafts that would potentially be between these trees and trees on the other side. Remember, we don't know exactly where oak wilt is in the root system. We just know that within a growing season, it could be all the way over here. So we could remove these trees and oak wilt could still be somewhere in there if we don't kill the roots. So we want to separate those roots from any other oak tree roots. So we put a 120-foot trench in here to sever any roots connected to these trees, and we put a trench in off the corner of the house to sever any roots between the infected tree and this tree here that we wanted to save. So when we're doing trenching, we call it trenching. It's really, the technical term would be root graft disruption. And in the Midwest and other areas where they have sandier soil and deeper soil, they actually use a plow, and it's got a 5-foot long blade on it. It's a vibratory plow that they sink into the ground and they just pull it and plow along. We're not so lucky in New York to have that type of soil, so we use a mini excavator or a backhoe. And basically, for most sites where we have done this, it's a matter of digging down to a depth of 5 feet, pulling the soil up and putting it right back in. The goal is just to break the roots. With the vibratory plow in the Midwest, they just pull it through. It leaves like a few inches of disturbed soil. You can barely tell it happened. So our method disturbs the soil a bit more, but the goal is to get down 5 feet so that you're getting, 99.9% of the roots that could be going through the soil. Down below those pictures are pictures of the spore mats. So you can see from the size, the picture here on the bottom left, this is a dime here, and here's the spore mat, this patch here. So they're not very large. They can get bigger. This is probably about the size of, the palm of your hand, this kind of scar that's been left behind. So this one was still growing, and then this we found after we felled a tree and pulled the bark back. But this is typically what you're looking for. And again, as they grow, they push the bark and can crack it open. But that's hard to tell. Oak has a lot of, furrowed deep furrows in the bark. And, so what's a crack from a pressure pad? What's just the bark growing? It's hard to tell. So again, that's why we focus on the leaf damage. Here, this picture out here, this is that homeowner again where we were saving the tree from on the back of her patio. We were concerned about the distance, how close it was to the infected tree, so we decided that when we did the root graft disruption, when we made the trench, we actually would pull the dirt out, and we put a heavy duty, basically what it is a heavy duty landscaping fabric down into the trench, down to the bottom of it, and then we filled back in. So what this does is the roots will grow. If there's any roots growing, they can grow up to it. And the tree in the back, the roots can grow over here. It's permeable, so water moves between it. So the roots will grow up to it and they'll stop growing. If there's water moving between it, they're happy if they can get their water, but they won't cross it. And so then they won't re-root graft together and potentially transmit any oak wilt that may be in the roots in the ground. If you use something like rubber or some other non-permeable material, just like a rubber material, the roots will actually, they've done studies, the roots will grow up to it and then grow along it and around it and regraft. So that's the importance of using a permeable barrier. So in the example that I gave prior, we used the Bruin model to estimate that root graft distance, the transmission distance. Our first find that we had in Schenectady, we actually just went out a straight 150 feet. So you can see the 150 feet mark is out here. And we took down all the trees in purple, which was about 90, just based on having these 4 infected trees here. So depending on what you find and where you found it, this was our first detection, and we Based on the information at the time, we knew it was 250 feet or 250 miles, excuse me, to the closest infection center. So we really wanted to hit it hard and cut it out if at all possible. We didn't want to take any chances. So that's why we went out the 150 feet. It resulted in cutting a lot of trees. And maybe some of those didn't have to come down. These are big, beautiful yard trees. These are actually pictures from that site. You can see these aren't trivial trees. We're talking about 60 to 90-foot tall trees, large diameters. Average diameter was about 18 inches there. And we took trees all the way up to 26 inches in diameter. And so these are trees coming out of people's yards. We did whole tree chipping for this, which is very expensive and complicated. And that was one of the reasons why as we found more, we decided, well, we can go and cut less trees using this model. So let's stick to the model and not take out more than we have to, because there are some studies that indicate you can cut out more trees than oak wilt was actually going to kill. So we're trying not to go too heavy-handed. We want to contain the disease while also, we want to protect the remaining resource while cutting as few trees as possible. So I just got some pictures from the air here, so that if you ever do end up with oak wilt, I would suggest getting up in the air and doing some aerial survey. These are the kinds of things that we see from the air. Here's this classic discoloration again, and you see it down here. You see these treetops all through here, and very thin and various stages of discoloration and leaf drop. You can get some things confused from the air, so there are things to watch out for. In New York, we have bacterial leaf scorch. I'm not sure how far that's made its way into New England yet, but bacterial leaf scorch also has similar discoloration late in the season. So this actually turned out to be a red oak with bacterial leaf scorch on it in the cemetery, but that is very similar to what we see for oak wilt. And then down here, we saw this picture. We started freaking out. Look at all these oaks with oak wilt. These turned out to be horse chestnut, and they have a really bad habit of browning in August. So this goes to the importance of ground truthing. If you're ever up in the air looking for oak wilt, you don't want to make a lot of assumptions, because there's a lot of other things that can be going on. These sites are all in urban areas. There's a lot going on in the ground here. This is a golf course in the background here. So there's always a lot of interesting activities going on golf courses. We have a suburban area here. This is actually an area with some horses. So you see some damaged trees here. Could that be from the horses? Could that be from oak wilt? You really got to get out there and take a look. There's a lot of things that discolor oak. So you cannot go by just the discoloration on its own, but that's really a good first step. The other thing that really can mimic oak wilt, especially midsummer, is if you have drought conditions. So you can see here this actually all the way goes up through Maine. So, but during the major part of the growing season, May to July in 2022, we experienced some severe drought across the state, where we were over 4 inches departed to the negative side of things in rainfall. And so when we did our aerial survey, we had so many trees that were discolored like this and had already dropped leaves, were very thinned out. And in our Canandaigua area, that resulted in us mapping almost 60 locations, and we had to go out and try to find all of these trees, and it resulted in us finding 2 new locations there. But again, if you're experienced drought, that leaf drop, midsummer can be tricky. And then also with drought, usually following drought, often two-line chestnut borer moves in. I'm not sure about how much two-line chestnut borer you folks have up there, but here in New York, if we get some droughty time, they move right into the oak and really finish them off. Typically with two-line chestnut borer, uh, the leaves hang on the tree, so you'll end up with all those wilted, shriveled up leaves, but they stay on the tree, the vast majority of them. Um, Again, I wouldn't use that maybe as your only reason to say, oh, it's two-line chestnut borer, not oak wilt. But that is what we've seen here in New York, and typically what they see in the upper Midwest is that trees hanging onto their leaves are most often two-line chestnut borer. So uh, let's get into a little bit of the Long Island scenario here. So like I said, that was very suburban. And so I got a map up here of one of our neighborhoods where we initially detected it here um, in Islip on Long Island in Suffolk County. But originally we had 4 small trees here that were tested and showed up as positive. So when we have it in a neighborhood like this with a lot of trees and a lot of houses and a lot of stuff all crammed into a small area, you can do an aerial survey, but really the best thing to do is go out on the ground. So all these blue highlighted properties, we went out on foot and visited every single one of them, knocked on each door, said, hey, here's what we're here for. We found oak wilt in the neighborhood. We need to come and inspect your trees. And so on all these properties, we went in and inspected the oaks, and we made notes of, this property doesn't have any oak. This property has 3 oak or whatever. And any notes like that that could be important for any future concerns that we had there. And so once we did that, and that takes, we spent a week on it. We were there in the evenings. We were there on the weekends to make sure that we could talk to every homeowner and get in there and see their property. So then we ended up with that visual survey, we ended up with several more points that we thought were of concern. So then we go back and we did our sampling at that point, and we came up with additional positive trees here in near this location. And this is actually, even though this is suburban, several of these properties had tiny like horse paddocks, and so we actually ended up working in a tiny horse paddock back here. And then we had a positive tree over here at this location and a positive tree down here at this location. But I don't think, maybe from the air we would have seen those, but some of these were smaller trees that are kind of tucked in. The canopies are really close together or overlapping with other trees. So I would really stress, if you find it in a neighborhood, the importance of going around door to door. Plus, it's great outreach. You talk to every person in the neighborhood about the threat to their oak trees, and you generally get a pretty positive response. I've mentioned sampling. So the sampling protocol that we've been using up till now is branch sampling. So you need branches approximately 1 inch in diameter and 8 to 10 inches long, and 8 to 10 branches like that off of symptomatic branches. Off of symptomatic limbs with leaves still on there. And so we would climb trees, use climbers, use lifts to collect these samples. There is a new protocol that's going to be coming out very soon, if it's not out already, that's going to allow for leaf sampling. They're able to test from the petiole. So you would be able to collect actually leaves that are falling off of the tree, so you don't have to climb up there and get them. When you get into sampling, there's a few things that are really important about sampling, and the major one is getting a fresh sample and packaging it up on ice and getting it to your diagnostic lab quickly. We overnight everything. That's the preferred method. Again, I said this fungus doesn't grow on the tree until a very specific moisture content and temperature, and we have found that samples that get really hot or too wet or dry out they come back as negative all the time, and we get false negatives that way. So it's really important to keep them cool and to get them right out to the diagnostic lab so that you have the best sample and the best chances of getting accurate results. So the other thing that we do and that I recommend is using some sort of regulatory policy to create small quarantine districts, or I don't know what you would call them there. That's the language that we have. We're allowed to quarantine small areas for forest health, pests and diseases. And so basically how these work is when we find an infected tree in a single area, we go out about a half mile and then we look where there's roads or property boundaries that could make a good quarantine boundary. And we put a line around it and we say, you can't move any oak out of there during the growing season. And over the winter months, you can move oak out with a permit. That way we know what the risk is, and we can tell people, no, your neighbor has oak wilt, and your trees, you've got some dead trees on your property, so we're concerned your trees could have oak wilt too. You can't move them. We've worked with landowners who've held logs over the season and covered them just to exclude any beetles or anything from them, just in case. Because again, you see our map, we have it in, quote unquote, across the state, but it's, in 3 pretty distinct locations, and we want to keep it that way. So we really do try to limit the movement of wood out of these areas. So one place you can see we did that was down in Brooklyn. So we had a detection right here in the cemetery, 1 positive tree. This isn't exactly a half mile. If we went out a full half mile, we would have been including an astronomical number of people and businesses that we would have had to conduct outreach to. So our zone here is a little bit smaller, but basically it includes the entire cemetery and the neighborhood around it. And this was this was a pretty important action that we took. Because the cemetery, obviously being in Brooklyn, they have big old trees and there's nowhere to deal with them on site. They all have to get trucked out somewhere. So the cemetery, we had to put under permit to move out all of their oak wood trimmings, any debris, any trees they took down. They had to wait until the winter until we would let them move that out. Once we get past a single location, if we get more than 2 of these individual locations like this in a town, then we go to a town-wide type of quarantine. So this is the town of Glenville here in Schenectady. We had the initial detection here and then another detection over here. They were far enough apart that we thought they weren't related. So we quarantined them separately, and then we had this detection over here. So we decided the whole town was at risk, so we quarantined the whole town. So anybody who wants to move oak out of the town of Glenville has to receive a permit from us. And then, okay, so you see the red line here around all of Suffolk County. That's because we had 4 locations across the county. So we said, well, this is really blowing up down there. Let's quarantine the whole county. So we try to do it at kind of a graduated level so that we're not impacting the industry too much, or municipalities or businesses trying to do their work. But we still want to be able to protect that resource from oak wilt. We don't want to let it get out and start running rampant. I mentioned bacterial leaf scorch earlier in the presentation. This cemetery has a lot of bacterial leaf scorch and they treat for it. This branch here, these leaves were on a tree that was positive for oak wilt, but also positive for bacterial leaf scorch. So you can have a couple things going on at a time. It's not super common, but if you look at some discoloration and you go, oh no, that looks totally like something else, it can't be oak wilt. If it discolored at the right time of year and it's dropping leaves, I would always test it. We always err on the side of caution. We test several samples every year, just because, again, even the visual cues can be a little confusing from time to time. So we've done a little bit of work with the beetle vectors that I've talked about, some trapping, using funnel traps, and then we worked with Cornell, and we actually have found these Nidoodly beetles quite a distance away. So here's those positives around Canandaigua Lake. This is Steuben County, a whole county to the south, and then 2 counties to the west where we have found positive beetles as well. So we're wondering if oak wilt, the fungus is out on the landscape and the beetles, and we just don't get that perfect storm of conditions that allow for infection very frequently. So we're really trying to follow up on this and figure this out. But basically, you need a wound, you need a beetle with the fungus on it. That beetle needs to be to the wound within a few days before the wound starts healing over. And then it needs to have those really narrow conditions of moisture and temperature. So, we're trying to figure that out. Is there a lot of oak wilt on the landscape? Are we finding it? What's going on? One thing, I would suggest for anybody working on oak wilt is figure out what your beetle vectors are and when they're out. So we did some trapping, and this is pretty consistent with the upper Midwest. Usually your beetle populations are most active May through beginning of July. And that's when we've gotten most of our positive samples. In 2021, we had a peak of positive samples, but we've also had several samples positive later in the season. You can see in September. One thing with oak wilt is it doesn't seem to get into trees very well once they start putting on late wood. So the early wood is very porous, so it's thought, the oak wilt can move through the cells and move up and down the tree very easily, whereas that late wood, it's a lot denser and it's harder to move through. So all these late positives may not be of much consequence just because of the physiology going on in the tree. But it's still important to note, what's going on out there. So I talked about these Schenectady sites before. So here they are starred. And then I've got this point up here next to Middle Grove. This is about 15 miles straight line distance. And so this is one of our latest beetle positive trap catches. So we put those funnel traps out here and caught a beetle. So what we're doing is we're trying to find trees that are tied to these beetles. Where did this beetle come from? Where did it pick up the spores? And that's proven very difficult. So one thing that we're doing is using drones. We go and we put it up over top of where the trap was. We angle the camera down, and then we do a nice smooth 360 of the immediate area. We raise it up a little bit, and we get another ring out, and we can take 4K video that then can come back in the office, and we can sit and view it on the screen and see, all the trees, dead trees, discoloring trees, whatever. We can pinpoint their locations and go out and find them. So that's just kind of this example here. There's a couple of the staff people. And this, in New York, we have a drone program, so we can send missions out to our drone pilots, and they can go collect this data for us without us having to go out there and then send it back to us. I mean, it takes us out of the woods a little bit, but it's far more efficient time-wise to have them collect the data and us view it on our computers. So that's what we're doing there. Outreach is another huge component of our program. This is down in Brooklyn. So if you have an oak wilt detection in an urban, suburban area, make sure you know your audience, who you're speaking to, that site in Islip where they had the horse paddocks. A lot of those folks had landscape companies that did a lot of work for them and tree removal companies. And they specifically said, if you give us materials printed in Spanish, we can give this out to all the people that work in the neighborhood, and it would be better than giving them the English stuff. So we produce a lot of Spanish language material. And then when we were working in Brooklyn with the local forester there, there's a large Mandarin speaking population there. So we said, well, how do you reach, folks in Brooklyn en masse, and how do you reach people that speak Mandarin? So we actually purchased bus shelter ad space, and that's what you're seeing here in the two pictures on the left. And we had them made in Mandarin as well for some of the bus stops that had the majority Mandarin speaking clientele there. So again, I think you got to know your audience and what they're doing, and in New York City, millions of people are riding the bus. So we thought, well, let's give it a try. And we received one call where somebody referenced seeing it at the bus stop. So I figure, I don't know, that's kind of a win. And then social media is the other big thing for us. We reach the general public, thousands of people through social media. We don't we have other organizations that do a lot of public presentations and speaking to the public. But our program, we really try to focus on speaking to professional organizations and groups such as this one, so that we can kind of, it's kind of a train the trainer, or, kind of multiplying the eyes out there. So just because there's millions of people in the public in New York here that we would have to reach. So for us, more passive ways such as social media, not only Facebook, but Instagram and X and the whole nine yards, we use, and we get a lot of reports through using social media. One other cool thing that we do is we've tried some different methods of detection, including using what we call detector dogs or conservation dogs. So there's a couple different dogs here in the pictures, and this was us training them. And so you can see there's the dog sitting there underneath that oak tree. This is fall time, totally normal tree. But what we did is we had some cultures that we had on petri dishes that we would tuck in the tree, like up on a branch, and see if the dog could detect it. And indeed, the dog could detect it. So that proved really promising. So we took it out in the woods. You can see in the bottom right, we had some logs from a tree that we knew had oak wilt, and we had the dog search around those logs. And the dog did give kind of a tentative, signal to one of them. But it turns out, out in the forest, it's a bit trickier. There are a lot of things, a lot of decaying wood, a lot of different fungi out there. So it was a little less clear if that was an actual signal or not, because the dog was really excited. Then we also took it to one of the sites. This is the bottom left picture, where we had a couple trees with oak wilt, and the homeowner had a portable band mill, and the dog hung out around the band mill quite a bit. Never signaled, but was very interested. And we thought, maybe I wonder if the homeowner has cut up some oak wilt killed trees in the past, maybe a log that went through or something. So yeah, so proof of concept, it works. But in New York, we don't have enough oak wilt to keep the dog trained and keep the dog happy and working. It needs to find oak wilt on occasion for the dog really to work out. So we haven't been using it much, but definitely something that works. And then just in the last couple minutes here, I wanted to bring up some cost information for us. So these are just a selection of sites that we've had over the years. In the land use type, not forest or forest, the not forested ones are all suburban landscapes, like the Glenville overhead map that I showed you. And so the cost has been significant per tree. You can see by using contractors and how far we went out, what we paid per tree. And then when you go to a forested setting, the cost can go way down because, maybe if you have an in-house logging crew or sawyers, you can do it in-house, or just generally cutting a tree down in the woods is way cheaper than cutting it down and using a crane to pull it over a house. So we kind of have spent the gamut here. And done a range of things here, but you can see, per tree we could be spending up to $3,000. We don't want to do that too much. But overall, even at that per tree cost seeming pretty high at $3,000, over the past, well, our analysis doesn't include the past, I think, 3 or 4 years, but 11 years of Oak Wilt management, we didn't spend more than over $1 million in that 11 years. And the highest year we spent was 2017, just over $300,000. But that was a year where we found all those sites in Suffolk County and some of the sites around Canandaigua. So we just had a high number of sites. But as you can see, the costs kind of go up and down a little bit, depends on how much you have. But if you can focus your efforts on monitoring with existing staff, so train, whoever you're working with, they don't even have to be forestry types. Anybody who's outdoors, DOT type folks they're just around trees. They may not be working on the trees necessarily, but they can go, oh yeah, we were working on the road and there was a group of dead oak there. With that kind of monitoring, you can really keep costs down. In the upper Midwest, where Oak Wilt is out of hand and they have to manage it on an annual basis, municipalities are spending $1 million or more every year managing trees that are dead, dying, whatever, doing that root graft disruption and cutting down trees. So so in New York, again, we put a lot of effort into the monitoring and managing it when it's really small. I mean, $300,000, and we managed probably 6 sites that year. I think that's doing pretty well. And you can see, most of our costs is personnel costs. That's an expense we're paying anyways. So and then the treatment cost, if you include the first year where our prices were really high, has been a third of our cost. But when you get out of those overpriced ones, it's actually been a pretty small amount, our treatment of those sites. It really is just keeping staff out there looking. And then last but not least, I said I would mention firewood. So that nondescript dark patch, the pathologist we brought out from the upper Midwest in 2008, he picked up that piece of firewood. He said, this is an oak wilt scar. This tree had oak wilt. So we know you can find it on firewood, and we know it moves on firewood. Of course, we have a firewood regulation in New York where we don't allow movement more than 50 miles. Always think about firewood when you're dealing with oak wilt. And then, this is a poster that we made. And just going back to, again, outreach materials, some pretty pictures, and knowing what beetles you have out there on your landscape is really helpful. So, I guess I'm going to wrap it up now. So, we've talked about oak in general. I've just been saying oak, but I do want to circle back to that. Oak wilt can impact and will impact red oak and white oak species, okay? But there's a difference between what happens. Red oak trees, which is pretty much all the pictures you've been seeing and all the trees that we've managed here in New York, and generally what gets managed when folks are managing oak wilt, even in the upper Midwest. The focus is on the red oak group because they root graft to each other more than white oak root graft to each other. And red oak form those spore mats. White oak very rarely forms the spore mats. So when we're managing oak wilt, we focus on red oak because it has the spore mats and the root spread vectors that we're really concerned about. And the trees die quickly within like 6 weeks of infection. Once you know it's infected, and boom, it's out the door. White oaks, when they get it, they'll die limb by limb, kind of, because they're better at forming the tyloses. They clog the water transporting vessels. The fungus can't move past it, but of course it kills the branch because it's got no water. But then the rest of the tree will live. So you can see white oak get it and die, but it could be over the course of 5 to 7 years, and you may not even realize that it's oak wilt because it could just look like some other kind of more regular dieback from stress or general decline or whatever. So white oak can impact, or oak wilt can impact both trees in the red oak group and the white oak group, but management is focused on trees in the red oak group because of transmission risks. I think that's all I've got, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And if there's time to take questions, I'll take questions.
I believe there is. And Amy, I don't see anything in the chat, but if you do, let me know. And folks who want to come off mute can certainly raise their hand and ask a question that way. But first off, thank you, Rob. That was a really great comprehensive review of both the disease and as well the approaches you're taking to management in New York, which I'm guessing most people on the call probably seem a little bit extreme. But this is the sort of thing that you need to do when you really want to limit the spread of a potentially devastating pest like oak wilt. I'm going to start. I did have a couple of questions myself. And as a program manager, I'm sure that others on the call, like Allison, are thinking the same thing. So you talked a lot or a bit about the money that you spend. I'm curious where that money is coming from. Is it coming from state sources? Is it a collaboration? Is APHIS helping to pay for this? Anything you know?
Yeah. So oak wilt is not a federally regulated pest. So APHIS doesn't provide any funds, the Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, because they don't regulate it. We do, however, receive funds from the U.S. Forest Service, and I should have mentioned that during the presentation. They provide funding for staff and travel, and they've provided money for equipment in the past. In New York, we also have this cool thing called the Environmental Protection Fund, which is funded through a real estate tax, transaction tax, and some other taxes. That's millions of dollars, and we get money from that annually to support invasive species projects. So we are able to tap into that money for some of our work as well.
So in the instances where you're working on private property, those homeowners aren't having to kick in some of that cost?
That's correct. Yeah, we don't, we do all the management as the state. We don't, because we think we have so little around, or we're finding so little at this point, we think it's advantageous for us to do the management, to make sure it's done properly. And gets done in a timely fashion, because it has to be done before spore mats and beetles, and it's pretty particular. So we do it all. So we also pay for it all. It's a service to the homeowner or landowner.
That's great. One of our former colleagues here at the DACF, Nancy Olmstead, says that we're always jealous of that environmental protection fund that you guys have in New York. Let's see here. I had a question. I'm not sure how many people on the call would have asked this question, but that you mentioned the landscape fabric that was used in that one instance to deter root growth. Is that something that's treated with some sort of pesticide to deter the root growth? And that's how you're able to provide something that's permeable, but the roots aren't actually penetrating?
So you can get them that are herbicide treated. The one that we used was not. So, but and I don't, it's like a landscape fabric. I don't know exactly what it is, and I haven't handled it in a long time. That was about 6 or 7 years ago we did that project. So I wish I could tell you the name of it. But it's made for this kind of thing. It's made to be a root barrier. So, yep.
Great. And Nancy also asks, is the management on private property voluntary? Are those landowners required to participate?
They are required to participate. So, another thing that I makes us a little different in New York, I guess, aside from having the beautiful EPF, is in our state legislation, we have access to all properties for forest health issues in New York. So um, everything that we do is a partnership with the homeowners. We've never actually had to force anyone into management, but we actually do have that legal authority to say, nope, this tree's going to become infected or it is infected, and we have to remove it from the landscape to protect the rest of the forest resource. We had that initial location in 2008, and then in the same location, we had another detection in 2013. And that is because in 2008, a homeowner pushed back on us and said, I want to keep this one particular tree. Because at that time, like I said, we were cutting all the trees within root grafting to within 150 feet. And so he really wanted to push back, and we wanted to make sure the management was done and done correctly and in a timely fashion. So we said, okay, you can keep that one tree, but you need to trench around it and pay for that trench yourself. So there is an instance where we did make the landowner pay for part of the management because he wanted to deviate from our approved plan with the Forest Service. And then 5 years later, that tree became infected, and we cut it down at that point because there was nothing else you could do. So we do work with the landowners as much as possible, and generally they understand. It's a weird disease, and it spreads through insects and underground, so it's not something you can follow super easy. So explaining to folks that you need to take some trees down to save the whole, a lot of people they understand, and they willingly participate to save the rest of the trees.
Great, thanks. Let's see, another question here. White oak is a favored species for assisted migration in Maine. What would you recommend land stewards consider about high quality plantings of white oak, given that the response is different from red oak in relation to oak wilt and its spread?
Oh, that's a great question.
Kind of loaded.
Yeah, so oak wilt on its own, and we say this about so many pests, right? Oak wilt on its own isn't going to be spreading super fast and like come into a neighborhood near you, next year. So planting trees is obviously a very long-term thing, and could have a long-term impact. But as of right now, I think with white oak, plant it as you normally would. I don't think I would be super concerned there. If oak wilt showed up, tomorrow in Maine, I would definitely say really think about where you're planting red oaks. But yeah, it's really tough to say just how long you have and before you even have oak wilt there, if you should rush into that or not. Um, when we create those quarantine districts, we actually within them we create a very tiny oak-free zone where we don't let the homeowners plant red oaks in their yard for at least 5 years after oak wilt's been found there. But even that's red oaks. So yeah, I mean, plant good quality trees as always. Do a good job planting them. Give them the best chance possible. That goes for anything, I think.
That's great. Good response. And I would say, Maddie, too, where possible, try to source your material locally. not from areas where oak wilt could be easily transported. Certainly in the case of landscape trees, a lot of materials coming from outside of Maine. So where you can try to find local material. That is all I see as far as questions in the chat, and I don't see anybody with hands up. So thank you, Rob, for your time. Again, that was really a great presentation. Really, really good articulation of a lot of points that we're talking about in relation to other pests. But particularly, I take the point home when it comes to moving firewood. I think a lot of people think about the pests that are here and trying to limit the spread around, but we maintain that firewood quarantine from out of state sources as well, and there are very particular reasons that we continue to maintain those quarantines. So thank you, and
you're
thank
welcome.
you for all of you on the call being eyes and ears as to looking for these forest pests. So we'll move on now. We're going to do a Forest Service summer forest health conditions update. Allison Canody, state forest entomologist, is coming on to cover that. So thank you, Allison.
Thanks, Jan, and thanks again, Rob. I'm going to share my screen here. You can hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, perfect. So I'm just going to give a quick overview of some of the things that we're seeing here in Maine this summer, and also things that we've seen in previous summers that are impacting our forest health. And as always, this is built on the work of a lot of colleagues. So I just want to start out with a key message in case it gets lost in the talk, and that's that an inventory of urban and municipal trees is really important to understanding both what concerns are most relevant to your town and also where to focus your limited resources. So a lot of times, as Rob pointed out, you have particular host trees that are of concern for different insects and diseases. And with that, just a little bit about emerald ash borer, since this is a municipal update on emerald ash borer. Right now, we're towards the end of our survey season in May. Our crews are going to start taking the traps down in the next couple weeks. That will be the second servicing of the year. The traps will be inspected for signs of emerald ash borer. That's our purple prism traps. We have almost 200 throughout the state. We also have a higher number of green funnel traps that have been serviced all summer long. And so those will also come down in September. In addition to the purple prism and green funnel traps, we have trap trees, I think more than 50 scattered around the state. And those will be removed starting later in the fall. They'll be peeled to look for signs of insect activity. So we'll have a better picture on those survey results basically come November as to where we have new detections of emerald ash borer. A lot of our detections also come from the public, and so we do welcome your reports of suspected emerald ash borer. And I'd say even in areas where it is already known to be established, we welcome your reports because it helps us fill in the information about its distribution so that folks can make informed management decisions when they're dealing with ash. I did want to bring to your attention, and these will be in our upcoming conditions report that's going to come out probably later today, but we do have a number of events related to emerald ash borer coming up in September and October. Coming up not next weekend, but the weekend after in Old Town, we have Forestry Field Days where we'll have both Brittany Shapak and Gabe LeMay will be there to give a forest health tours during that field day. In late September, we have Common Ground Fair and Unity, and Colleen Tierling will be giving a presentation on emerald ash borer on September 21st, along with the APCA lab. On October 3rd, I'll be at the Maine chapter of American Public Works, giving a talk on emerald ash borer and brown-tailed moth management in municipalities. And October 8th to 9th is the Brown Ash Symposium hosted by APCA at the Wells Conference Center in Orono. So a number of opportunities to get out and learn more about this pest and others. Moving on to brown-tailed moth. This is a pest that's been a topic of a number of our updates in the past. And it is an invasive hardwood defoliator. Folks in Maine are probably familiar with it. This time of year, it's tiny caterpillars. They're less than usually about a couple millimeters long. They have dark patches towards their heads on their bodies. Those are dark patches of hair. And towards the tail end, they have these two, they're sort of yellowish orange dots at this stage of the caterpillar that are what will be the bright orange glands as the caterpillars mature. Those caterpillars are out skeletonizing leaves right now, and now's a decent time to start to get an idea of whether you have high populations in your area. Those lower populations aren't going to be visible until the leaves fall. So one of the things that is good news is that the populations appear to be down in many areas. We had a lot of fungal disease in populations, and our early spring or early summer aerial survey flights actually picked up less than 2,000 acres of damage. So that's versus tens of thousands of acres in the previous years. We do expect that there's still scattered populations that are heavy out there. And so more than ever, it's important to hear from you as to where you're seeing brown-tailed moth. We do expect it to be extremely patchy this year. If you're going to do management in brown-tailed moth, you need to do fine-scale population assessments. So those are done from the ground usually. They can be done aerially. Our drone program has been impacted by rules that have limited the use of the drones that are currently in possession of the Forest Service. So we are working through that. But at any rate, the assessments should happen in the areas where you intend to do the management, and really as a municipality, probably focusing on those areas with high public use and outdoor activities. Another key thing for municipalities to consider is public education. It's really important to help those people help themselves avoid exposure. A lot of times we see folks with really small trees in their yard just loaded with webs that could have been pruned had they known what they were going to be facing the following spring. We have designated February as Brown-tailed Moth Awareness Month, mostly because it's really easy to see the webs that time of year, but also because there's still some time to set up management and manage them before the trees start to become active in the spring as far as web clipping, and also before all of the pesticide applicators are booked up. A related invasive moth is spongy moth. We had a number of years of defoliation from that pest beginning in 2021. Those populations have collapsed, but the impacts from feeding and also drought were really quite severe. And so Rob had mentioned two-line chestnut borer. We're seeing impacts from that native agrillid species in some of these stands that were hard hit by spongy moth, with mortality of both of the hardwoods, especially the oaks. But we also see some softwood mortality in those stands because in several instances, the caterpillars ran out of food, dropped down and fed on things like hemlock and white pine. And so from the public tree management perspective, you want to think about those dead hardwoods and also what sort of impacts they may have on infrastructure. So you may want to target removal of some of those dead trees to prevent damage to or public safety risks. And this map here shows the areas where we were able to map hardwood mortality in our aerial surveys this past year related to that spongy moth defoliation. Another invasive hardwood defoliator, we have a lot. This one is coastal so far, is winter moth. We had the most severe impact from it in sort of the Saginaw County region, as well as parts of Lincoln County, Booth Bay Harbor area. And in this case, it also feeds heavily on oaks, but also maples and other hardwoods. We do have a biocontrol that we have released for a number of years in Maine that can help to bring winter moth damage down to a point where it's the caterpillar itself is nearly undetectable. It does need to work with other natural enemies, other predators, such as soil-dwelling arthropods, and also small mammals. And so One of the keys in responding to this pest is encouraging folks to maintain a natural enemy-friendly landscape. And so that may mean limiting pesticide application, changing the types of pesticides that are used in different approaches to landscape management, creating shelters and areas for both insects and mammals to survive. We do know that the winter moth parasitoid, the Siphonis albicans, can establish in Maine and can bring populations down. We've seen it in some locations where winter moth has been a problem in the past. But we also know that it can take a while for those natural enemies to take effect. And so if you do have high value ornamental street trees that are affected by winter moth, you do want to consider treating them in order to maintain their health in that landscape. And so one way to monitor them is to use sticky bands in the wintertime to look for the emerging moths that will let you know what sort of populations you're looking at next year. And then you can treat them when necessary. Oftentimes a systemic is used to treat those trees. And there are also foliar applications of pesticides that can be used. One thing to know about winter moth is it does spend a half a year in the soil. So after the caterpillars finish feeding, they drop down to the soil to pupate. And because of that, they can be moved really readily in the soil. And so we encourage people to educate the public about bare root plant sales. So you're not moving soil that is potentially carrying winter moth cocoons with it. And also just to be aware that not only soils, but also soil amendments such as mulch that are underneath those infested trees pose a risk for spread of this organism. The good news about the biocontrol is that we do expect it to act fairly quickly in comparison to other biological control agents that we are familiar with in the forest. So we expect it to be, effective in the span of a decade or a couple of decades versus many decades. But we do have quite a bit more area that is impacted by winter moth than we have biocontrol available for release. So this map shows our trap catches in the orange circles for winter moth. We had some all the way out to Lubec that were pretty high, as well as on MDI and in coastal areas in Waldo County. And then our releases so far have gone as far as Lincoln County. So from down in York County all the way to Lincoln County. We did have a release in Vinyl Haven in our very first year of winter moth management with biological control. And then we have a whole area of potential impact that, we will be looking to collect biocontrol to release in the future. Does not seem to be traveling on its own at a rate that's enough to limit that damage in those forests down the coast. I did also want to mention, as long as I'm mentioning soil, that we also think about soil as an important vector for jumping worms. So it's another good reason to limit movement of soil materials with your landscaping from areas that have jumping worm infestations. So to date, we've seen jumping worm in most counties in Maine. For the most part, we've seen them in landscape settings, but we have had a couple of instances where they've been found in the forest. And so going forward, we're going to do some monitoring of those forests to look at impacts. But for those that don't know, jumping worm is a non-native group of earthworms from Asia. They're parthenogenetic, so they do not need males to reproduce. They can spread pretty readily in landscape materials, as fishing bait, those sorts of activities, plants. And in the forest, they cause, well, wherever they are really, they cause a very quick recycling of the organic matter, which can be a problem for things like rooting of seedlings and availability of nutrients in those soils. So this just shows, it's a little bit old, but from last year where we had jumping worm detections in Maine. As you can see, they're fairly widespread in the southern half of the state. As far as those detections, they're likely in other places as well. Moving on, I did want to give a brief update on beech leaf disease. Those of you who've been on this call for a while know that it was found pretty recently in 2021 in Maine. And there's still actually a lot to learn about this disease because it's also relatively new at the continental scale as far as our knowledge about it. The most recent treatment recommendations that we are working on is using thiabenzidol macro injections in order to try to prevent the development of symptoms of this disease. Our pathologist is actually out today doing some trial injections in Camden, and we do have a small trial that's being put in place by the Maine Forest Service. So looking for beech bark disease-free trees in order to try to maintain some of that genetic diversity in the forest areas of the state. Another sort of experimental treatment is the use of polyphosphate 30 fertilizer to help limit disease development. That has shown some promise, particularly in smaller trees where it's been tried in Ohio. And we do have a trial of that underway in Maine as well in Augusta. Another way that is recommended to reduce the amount of disease in stands is to do some pruning, or in trees is to do some pruning to decrease airflow, or to increase airflow and decrease the free moisture available on the leaf surfaces, since it's thought that moisture may play a role in spread of the nematodes that cause the disease. But this really remains an open question. It's something that can be tried, but in general, if you have important beech trees in your landscape, you should plan for either management using one of these experimental approaches if they're really significant landscape trees, or management of the declining trees in the case that they become a threat to public infrastructure. And this map was put together by Gabe LeMay, one of our entomologists, and it shows the detections of beech leaf disease in the state to date. This was actually as of Saturday. Shows that we've had 174 confirmed positive towns in the state since 2021, with 77 just this year. The circles are detections by our staff. The diamonds are detections through public reports. So you can see how important the public is in reporting not only this disease, but other forest insects and diseases that we have impacting our landscape. And you can also see that the spread since the detection, or the spread of detections since it was first found in 2021 has been really rapid. We've seen it all the way from southern Aroostook County to our borders with New Hampshire. And to date, the only county where we haven't had detections of beech leaf disease is Franklin County. And then one final disease organism I wanted to mention is white pine needle damage. This has been a chronic stress on white pine trees in Maine. I started as an entomologist with Forest Health and Monitoring in 2007. Or 2006, sorry. We were already seeing that damage at that stage, and it's been an annual partial defoliation of those trees pretty much ever since in one area of the state or another. We do see some mitigation with drier conditions, but not always. Sometimes we get as severe damage in years following a wet spring, or as we do in years following a dry spring. So it does seem to be something that we are going to see on a somewhat annual basis for the long term. And one of the things that folks seem to think now is that that yellow and orange coloration of the needles in late spring and early summer is just normal pines shedding their needles. And I just want to stress that that is actually disease and not normal. It does weaken the trees, and if it's severe, it can make them susceptible to secondary stressors. And we especially see tree decline in areas near waterways, which makes sense because this is caused by fungal diseases, which are aided by plenty of free moisture. And again, so it gives you one more species to look at as far as managing those declining trees that are a threat to public safety. We've seen at least one instance where some of these one of these compromised pines actually killed somebody on the roadways when it fell down. So it's important to be aware of this chronic stress on white pine trees. And this just shows you a little bit more of what you can see with that white pine needle damage, the sort of general yellowing of the foliage in the late spring or early summer. Usually we see it in June. And then with repeated defoliation, you can start to see crown dieback and eventually tree mortality.
There's 6 minutes left, Allison.
Okay, I think I will probably stop there then, so that we can have some time for questions. Just give a plug for our conditions reports. So folks can scan that QR code and you can sign up for our conditions reports if you're not already subscribed to them. I see in the chat that Jake asks, does it make sense to use the leaf disease to kill at least part of a beech bark disease infected stand and therefore create room for regeneration of other species? I think we can expect that beech leaf disease will cause mortality in those understories of beech stands. To what extent, I'm not sure we really know at this point, and I'm not sure there's anything we can do about it either. So whether we're allowing it to kill them or it's just going to kill them, I think is kind of a moot question.
Great, thanks, Allison. Folks, again, can raise their hands using the raise hand function, and we can take you off mute, or we can just unmute the lines probably at this point, Amy, too. Before more people drop off, again, if you are looking for credits, you do need to take that quiz. And Amy reminded me that quiz is only available through tomorrow at midnight or at midnight on the 28th. So please try to take that quiz before the quiz link closes. And she's just reposted it again there. So feel free to add your questions into the chat or raise your hand. And we can take questions. I believe Rob is still on to take questions about Oak Wilt or any of the insect and disease updates that Allison has provided in our summer forest health update. Jake, the quiz is posted in the chat. So if you open up the chat function I'm not sure where it appears on your screen. On mine, it's the little chat bubble, and that will open it up. And if you don't find it, we can certainly share that out too. I know Allison and I just got a question in our emails too about jumping worm management. If there are any options for jumping worm control in a landscape setting, if you want to touch on that one, Allison,
yeah,
or just refer to materials.
Yeah, as far as jumping worm management, the Bureau of Agriculture has a nice comprehensive page on jumping worms. In general, there are not wonderful management approaches available at this point. There's still a lot of work being done looking at management of jumping worms. But one of the things that I know is sometimes recommended is solarization. So actually making the soil really hot in order to try to cleanse it of those life stages of jumping worm. But one of the best management approaches is really preventing their spread to new areas.
Great, thanks. Not seeing any additional questions. Oh, and Gary Fish has also posted his email if you want to send any questions to him. He is with the DACF. For those of you who don't know him, state horticulturist within the Bureau of Agriculture. So thank you, Allison, for that update. And I would encourage folks also, if you do not already subscribe, the forest health updates are fantastic, very comprehensive updates on all of the various different things that are going on. Some of them may be things that you're seeing. Some of them may be, beyond your kind of peripheral vision, but really great information, really well put together. The program that comes from the Maine Forest Service, generally during the spring through fall seasons. We do not do forest health updates in the winter. Is that correct, Allison?
That is generally correct.
Generally, right.
Usually May through October.
Great. Well, we're closing in on noontime here, and so not seeing any additional questions or hands raised. I think we can probably wrap up. Thanks again to Rob Cole from the New York Department of Environmental Conservation and to Allison for providing the bulk of the information here today. And I encourage all of you to pay attention to your email bulletins. We will be doing another one of these. Generally, I believe the next one occurs in December, beginning of December, although I could be wrong there. So keep an eye on your inboxes for that announcement, and we will update you at that point on EAB and any other forest health concerns that we deem necessary at that point in time. But thank you for your participation. And again, if you're looking for credits, make sure you take that quiz and do so before midnight tomorrow. So thank you, everybody.